Please welcome Dr. Julie Esparza Brown. Julie Esparza Brown is a third-generation Chicana and an assistant professor in the Special Education Department at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. Currently, her teaching, research, publications focus on the interface of bilingual and special education. So welcome, Dr. Esparza Brown.
Hello, thank you for having me. Can you all hear me? I hope so. I'll trust that this is working. Okay, I'm going to pull up my, of course, where it is. There it is, my presentation. And here we go. Okay, thank you. I'm also going to look at my timer here so that I make sure to stay on time. There we go. Hi. Thank you so much, Katie and Morgan, for your presentation, which is really interesting that so many components of what I was hearing you talk about really fits into this framework that called PLUS that I will be sharing with you, that Dr. Amanda Sanford and I have been researching and working with. So it's like a perfect lead in to what I'm going to discuss next. So thank you for your wonderful work. So just to tell everybody, the presentation that I am using today was created in collaboration with my research partner, Dr. Amanda Sanford at Portland State University. So today we'll be learning about the unique needs of Latino bilingual learners, or we call them English learners. That I know that that's an old term, but that may be in some of my materials here. I think in Portland we use emergent bilinguals, and then in a lot of the writing that I've been doing recently, multilingual learners. So any of those terms are really talking about students who come from homes where English is not the native language or the primary language. So we're going to identify the key features of a culturally and linguistically responsive multi-tiered system of support. So I'm not sure what systems that you come from, what school systems, but the field has been working about 15 years now with looking at tiered supports for students, depending on their instructional needs. So we'll be looking at that model in a few moments. And then I'll be introducing you to our research-based framework that we call PLUS for planning instruction for Latino bilingual learners and emergent bilinguals. That actually can be used in both English instruction and in Spanish instruction. It's a fairly flexible framework. And hopefully with time, I'll be able to show you some videos too. Okay, so let's just quickly, because it sounds like many of you are bilingual teachers and probably really understand the background of our multilingual students. We know, I think as Katie and Morgan was saying in their presentation, that our group of students are not a monolithic group, but there are many different multilingual learners within our population. And it's really interesting. I was just looking at the data. It's something like 73% of English learners or emergent bilinguals are actually born in the United States. So a lot of times people that aren't very schooled in this group of students really think, oh, we're talking about foreign-born students. And actually we're not. And the data also show that of the different subgroups of English learners or emergent bilinguals, the ones that perform the poorest, the lowest performers are actually those born in the United States. So we really have to ask why. So it is all about, for my partner and I, is really working at enhancing all instruction. And that starts with core instruction for our learners. We know from research that the age and intensity of exposure to language or languages, and so our students are exposed to more than one language. If they're born in the United States, that usually happens at birth, which if we think of sequential or simultaneous bilinguals, when students are exposed to two languages from birth, oftentimes they can be called what we call a sequential bilingual, and that is they have good language development from the beginning of both languages. But for our students that come from homes where English is not used much, that exposure can be limited to English. So really understanding children's linguistic backgrounds helps us understand the profiles that we see when they come to school. And so we can't assume that children born in the United States, are those sequential bilinguals, because they still could have a lot more input in their native language and only hear maybe English on TV or radio, or maybe through older siblings. So it's important to look at that profile and to know that language development is optimal before the age of 3. So those of us in the K-12 system, we really want to encourage the language use at home and be working with families on how best to help have their students develop language in both languages to high levels, as well as our early childhood providers. Okay, so a little bit about language registers in school. If you've been around bilingual or ELD education as long as I have, because I've been around this almost 40 years, because I'm really old, as you can see by the wrinkles. And we used to identify the 2 language registers in schools as BICS and KELP. BICS being this basic register or basic interpersonal communication skills, and KELP, cognitive academic language proficiency. And now we basically label those 2 registers as social and then academic language. So the social language is everyday language that's informal language and that we use in everyday conversation. And that's what our English learners or emergent bilinguals first learn to speak, as our own children do with basic language. They model slang terms, high frequency words that are common, use simple sentence structures that may be supported by gestures, just like my grandchildren are doing right now as they're developing their language. And the tone and volume are going to be different, pretty informal with this everyday language use. So students learning English must engage in language practice across all content areas. So this register, this informal register, is going to support them in most of their day-to-day experiences on the playground, asking to go to lunch, whatever, but it's not going to support them in their academic development, and particularly in reading. So this academic language register is what we've all been talking about, and that Katie and Morgan were really emphasizing in the last presentation, is we have to help students become proficient also in academic language. So they may be proficient in social language, but that academic language is what they're going to encounter in texts and textbooks and in our own instruction as teachers. So, and it becomes especially important by late elementary and middle school when instead of learning to read, we're learning content via reading, which is really difficult for our language learners. So academic language includes complex words and phrases and is really critical to reading comprehension. So one tidbit here is evidence from Truckenmeyer and colleagues in 2019 said that linking new concepts using that everyday language or oral colloquial language as an explanation and then linking it to the academic language is really beneficial. So just using terms that are unknown terms and giving that term to students perhaps in their native language, they still may not know that term. So we really want to be sure that we're just not translating or interpreting or translating terminology that still is not comprehensible to students. So really unpacking those concepts. And we also know that students learning a second language in general will progress through the 5 stages. I still label 5 stages, although I know that WIDA and the ALPA test lump them into 3 bigger stages. But if you look at those more closely, we still do talk about students progressing through 5 late stages of language, from beginning language to full proficiency. That can take 5 or 7 years or more. And we know that for students who actually have disabilities, whether it be a language-based disability or a specific learning disability or an intellectual disability, will oftentimes take much longer or maybe never become fluent in English and maybe never in their native language as well. So this is a ballpark figure for kind of your average learner of the time that it takes. But in that time varies also depending on the rigor of our instruction on language. So it points back again to what they're getting in ESL classes, that all language can't be taught there. It has to be carried through as the last presentation really demonstrated through all content areas as well. Drink water here. But I want to make the comment as well that students come to us with language from their community, and that's going to get them, you know, conversant and communicative within their own community. And I hear teachers still kind of thinking and talking about the deficits of language that students come with. And I want to make sure that we really reframe that to, you know, that is their community language. While it may not be academic language, we still have to value the language that children come with, because language and identity are highly intertwined. So respect the language that students come to school with, while also teaching them the school language or the academic language, and then teach them when it's the appropriate time to use either one of those based on the formality of situations. Okay. So now with a little background on language, let's look at what is a multi-tiered system of supports, or known as MTSS, and specifically, how do you make that culturally and linguistically responsive, or we're kind of rethinking this now to culturally and linguistically sustaining. And I'll talk a little more about that in a bit. Okay, so what you have here is the typical MTSS visual, which is a triangle. And within that triangle, you'll see 3 levels, green, yellow, and red. And that stands for the level of need, the intensity of need that children have for instruction. So 80% of any group of students, so a 4th grade class, 80% of those should be at or about meeting standards. Well, there might be a group that needs strategic interventions or a little more support, and that's that yellow group. And then we know that with any population, there could be maybe 5% or so of students that are in that red group or need intensive interventions. That's just what is the typical, just statistically going to happen with any group. But when I look at groups with large populations of English learners, we often find that this is flipped, and we find that there's high levels of need for English learners, and fewer of them are at grade level or around grade level. And that then is going to speak more to instructional issues rather than any intrinsic issues with children themselves. So we want any group to kind of have this level of student within each of the intensity of instructional tiers here. Okay, so you'll also see that we wrap around the triangle our plus framework, which I'll show you in a little bit, to make it more culturally and linguistically responsive, knowing that the reason why we would see upside down triangles is because the instruction may not be relevant or aligned with our EB students' needs, both culturally, experientially, and linguistically. And that you also see here in the purple, oral language proficiency levels. We will have students at all levels of oral English proficiency and native language proficiency across all the tiers. And so every tier, whether it's interventions or core instruction, we have to be dealing with scaffolding the language for them as well as content. I want to introduce you here to our website, which is projectlay.com. That's going to have all the materials that we will be using today for your reference. We were funded about 5 years ago by a federal grant on a model demonstration grant looking at multi-tiered systems of support for English learners. This grant ended Project Lay grant ended, but we just received another grant from the OELA, Office of English Language Acquisition. So we will be transitioning this website to our new grant, but you will still be able to access all the materials using the website that you'll see at the end of the presentation. And there's lots of free information here, and it's just for use to disseminate to the field. On it, we are really proud of this particular tool, which is it's about a 12-page tool, but it is a multi-tiered systems of support for English learners implementation rubric. So you can use this to take baseline data on your own school system to see where you're at in terms of really disaggregating data by groups, making sure that your instruction is linguistically and culturally aligned, all of those pieces. So the components here are screening, progress monitoring, database decision-making, multi-level instruction, fidelity and evaluation. All of those are components of this rubric. It's a free download, and we found it really useful with the schools that we partnered with. And then we take a post-test at the end of the year to see what kind of progress has been made in making the system more responsive for EBs. Okay, so let me introduce you to our framework that we'll be talking more about for the rest of the presentation. It is called the PLUS framework, and Dr. Sanford, myself, and our former student Miranda Turner, who is now at, I believe, George Fox University, developed this in 2012 and have been working on it and trying to do some research on it since then. And what we did was, specifically, we were looking at ways to support literacy intervention programs. So like tier 2 and 3 programs that we know are not culturally and linguistically responsive, but they're really good at teaching the skills for which they're targeted to teach, such as literacy. So, but we know from good instruction of English learners, when we researched all the best practices, we were able to then kind of pull everything into these broad areas that we put into this acronym of PLUS. And so after looking at all the research, these were the critical components of instruction for EBs: pre-teaching critical vocabulary and priming background knowledge. L, language modeling and opportunities for practice. Using visuals and graphic organizers, systematic and explicit instruction, and strategic use of native language in teaching for transfer. So this then was created to be an overlay to intervention programs that you might be using with EBs in schools, like Reading Mastery or Rewards or Horizons, which I know some of you will be, oh, those are awful, we wouldn't use them. But you know, they are really good at teaching the skills. And once we add this piece of scaffolding for their language and background knowledge, then those programs, then we see kids really taking off. So don't discount those. We've also found that, and you'll see that happening a little later in a video, that in the schools we are working with, this framework then really resonated with tier 1 teachers or general education teachers, because it gives the broad ideas of best practices for supporting EBs. And we're not trying to reinvent GLAD or PSYOP. But again, we were looking at this for scaffolds for interventions, but gen ed teachers found this a really useful framework within tier 1. Okay, so this is what it looks like. On the website, we have, this is the lesson planning format that you can scaffold around your gen ed lesson or your intervention lesson with the components here. And we ask that you always include, besides the content objective, a language objective. And basically here is what you're going to teach, the vocabulary and the background knowledge that children might need to be primed in or taught, and systematic and explicit instruction. Now, this is another sometimes challenge that bilingual educators, there's been some differences in the field in terms of that systematic and explicit instruction, which is the I do, we do, you do model. And it's paced versus more of a balanced literacy approach. which happens in a lot of bilingual classrooms. But what we're trying to say is that in order for students to learn skills, critical skills, and particularly literacy skills, that workshop type approach probably has not been the strongest approach for our students, because when you look at NAEP data, we have long-standing and stubborn literacy gaps between English-only white students and our subgroups of students, huge gaps in achievement. So I am looking at how are we going to do this different and better to close those gaps. So we might need to tighten up our instruction. Okay, so we use this framework with our teachers in our partner schools and used what we call the video self-reflection process. And we taught the teachers about the framework, and we asked them to reflect on what were the components, learn about it. Then we turned them loose back into their classrooms to record a lesson that they were teaching of usually a small group that included English learners. And then they were to look at the video by themselves. So this was very non-threatening because we didn't ask them to share the video with anyone but themselves. And they used a self-observation form that is shared on this Latinx Summit website and also on our Project Lay website, where they then basically just observed how the lesson went and the components of the PLUS framework that they saw in their lesson, and also looked at how their students responded and the language that they used. And then they analyzed what the outcomes were in order to then go back and plan how they might tighten up instruction to provide more language support or background support, whatever they saw was needed. And this was a process that we offered several times a year in our partner schools, and the teachers came back and brought their friends. This was a really non-threatening way of them looking at, especially the gen ed teachers, of how to do better instruction for their EBs. So this is what the self-observation tool looks like. And you'll see the PLUS features down the left side here, and then some just some definition of what that could look like here. So under pre-teaching vocabulary and climbing background knowledge, it impacts, let's see, fast mapping unknown vocabulary, if you see that happening, and that's just giving students a quick definition of vocabulary that they might let you know they don't know, or if you used a specific vocabulary type of strategy to help them understand words, or if you use any kind of a system for them to help identify words as they're reading that was unknown to them, and to pre-teach any necessary background knowledge. You'll see language use and scaffolding, where we use sentence frames and provided opportunities to talk and write. And you saw many of those wonderful sentence frames used in Katie and Morgan's presentation. And I know I did see some questions, or a question in the chat, about when to stop using language frames. You know, when is enough enough? Well, for me, I think they're beneficial at every level. And even myself as an academic writer, I was just thinking about this today. I have a page of something called useful templates. It's actually several pages that even when I'm writing chapters and books and articles, I might go to that to use some of those scaffolds. So I think that they're appropriate at every level, and they should be a scaffold that we remind students that, you know, everybody uses them, so not be ashamed of them. They're just highly, highly efficient and effective. Then systematic and explicit instruction. Again, we're looking at giving good explicit instruction and making sure that their students are getting guided practice, and then partner and independent practice. And strategic use of native language, where you also saw that in the previous presentation, where students were looking at their science reading and translated some of the words. So as I said, I saw so many of the strategies that were used in the last presentation from our model. And what we try to do, again, our framework here is nothing new. It's all great instruction, but we tried to put it in a manageable framework and kind of chunks where it would be accessible for teachers and interventionists. Okay, so there's a closer look at the definitions there. And there is a flip side. So page 2 is you include here a language goal for the student. So what is it that you want students to do with that language that you're teaching them, or what language are you going to ask them to use? This also included opportunities to respond. So you tally how many opportunities students had to respond to your instruction as a group, in pairs, or individual. And what you want to see are lots of opportunities per minute. So we know that, what does research say? Like 80% of class time is teacher talk. We're trying to flip that so that there's more time spent with students talking. And then also any academic vocabulary that the teacher used, they'll note that, and that the students use, jot that down. Do students use complete lessons? So you can take notes on that. So what we actually asked the teachers to do was one time look at their use of the PLUS framework, then watch their video a second time to look at what students were doing. And then there are sections here for kind of grows and glows, and then identify what you would do next time to strengthen the lesson. Okay, so I'm going to delve into a little bit more of what these components could look like. Okay, starting with pre-teach critical vocabulary and primary background knowledge. So first of all, we define that as identifying explicitly teaching vocabulary and background knowledge that is unknown to students, but critical to their understanding of a passage or unit of instruction, right? And we know that those are essential for EBs to learn content and language. But we know also that language instruction has to move beyond just vocabulary. So while we talk a lot about vocabulary, don't forget that they have to really learn the whole structure of the English language, the phonology or the patterns of sounds in a language, and make those explicit connections between the sounds that they know in their native language and how those might transfer to English, or sounds that are completely different in the two languages. They also have to learn syntax, or how we organize words in English as compared to how in their native language words are organized to make meaningful sentences, and morphology, how words are formed. This is an especially critical component of teaching, and particularly teaching literacy, because when you teach affixes, prefixes and suffixes and root words, that really helps students to expand their knowledge of language and their vocabulary. And semantics, how vocabulary and word meanings are used, that really has cultural norms for that, and they vary by language. So children, sorry here, looking at my notes, you have to learn all of those components about language, so it's more than just vocabulary. And then the second part of this component is prime background knowledge. So we know that students come to us with, they're not a blank slate, with their own experiences, which may or may not be what is assumed in our gen ed curriculum, right? The gen ed curriculum kind of assumes knowledge of middle class America knowledge base. So our students aren't a blank slate, but they just might come with different experiences. So in order for them to really access the content and literacy, we need to perhaps provide some of that background knowledge for them, which can be done easily through videos and pulling up your phone and showing a picture of something. But we also want to really think about the terminology and the concept that we're using now in education more and more, culturally sustaining practices. And that is that first, we want to also honor the diversity. So those experiences that our students bring, we want them to be able to share those and to connect those to what we're teaching. And so that might look like having them question and answer about knowledge that they have that might be similar to what is assumed in the curriculum. Storytelling about maybe the content that we're teaching, using their multilingual abilities and giving us language about the content. And really using what those assets they bring from home to connect to instruction. I'm going to give you one quick example of when I was observing a class of how this didn't happen, but it easily could have been, it could have included this information. It was a reading out of an anthology about citizenship. I think it was about women's rights and voting rights. And the teacher talked a lot, it was a dual language class, talked a lot about citizenship and voting rights and all. And that was happening during the time that there were a lot of roundups of undocumented people happening in the Portland area. And it struck me as the teacher was talking that I bet that this was a difficult conversation for many of the students in that class who were, EBs and perhaps worrying about their own families at that time. So that should have been background knowledge and set a conversation to make this a safe space to students who might have been experiencing any discomfort from the concepts that they're talking about. And without acknowledging, that maybe they weren't documented, but giving them a safe place to talk about worries or also assets that everybody brings to this global community that we're building. So it's incredibly important to look at the content and help make those connections to students' own lives. And I know we all know this, but I always put it out there. Okay, the second one, language use and modeling, opportunities for using academic language. That means teachers models appropriate use of academic language, then provide structured opportunities, as was mentioned in the last presentation. I don't really need to go into that here because here you've got more examples, primary examples of language sentence frames and starters. You also have an example here, which I think is a fun one of it is sentence frames and starters that kind of have a built-in word bank. Over here is the one, a built-in word bank so that teachers, students can be extending their vocabulary, making choices and learning about synonyms. So sentence frames, they're a way to go. So those are the two components that we're going to be looking at in a video I'm going to show you in a moment. But I want to talk about what you'll also see in the video is they're working on language instruction and vocabulary instruction in a tier 1 or general education setting. We worked with teachers in our partner district. This process was used across every elementary school in the district where they had something that's called effective precision partnering. And this might have come from Kate Kinsella that was mentioned earlier. And so what the components are is there's intentional partnerships, meaning, we partner up people, tell them how to partner and don't leave it to students to figure that out on their own, because it's really important that you're making those for instructional reasons that you're partnering students together. That each partner has a clear role so that we can label them A and a B, or I've heard people call salt and pepper, whatever the label, but to understand that there's a clear role and when those roles would be switched. So that controlled alternation, you want to make sure that you give time for discussion and reflection by both parties, but both people in the pair. Because sometimes I see if you ask them just to switch, you're going to have the stronger student talk on, and then that student that has less language is going to be silent. So you want to make sure to time that and watch that partnership happens and that each have equal time. You want to have explicit tasks for both partners during the conversations, provide language supports through sentence frames and stems, and then monitor and give feedback. So you'll want to walk around the classroom and listen into the groups and give feedback. Okay, so those are really important components of when you do intentional language practice and partnering. Okay. All right, so on the Latino Latinx Summit website, I did post these as a Word document, but you probably didn't have time to print them out. You could just grab a piece of paper if you have any paper by you and look at the video to see what features of the plus model that you see in the video example. So here we have a video of a 4th grade teacher who did a model lesson that surrounded a 4th grade unit that came from their anthology used in the district about José Limón, who was a famous modern dancer from Mexico. So we'll watch the video example. And so this was not the first lesson in this unit. And so what you'll be looking for is how the teacher addressed the components of the plus lesson, PLUSS, and then give an overall rating. And the way we have the ratings on our observation framework here is not in place, somewhat in place, or in place. So did they have these scaffolds for language learners in place, or they at least tried, or maybe they weren't addressed at all. So you'll be looking specifically at what we talked about so far, which is pre-teaching the critical vocabulary and primary background knowledge, and then language use and modeling and opportunities for practice. I'll note here that this is an example of a story that had so much potential as a rich cultural scaffold, and you won't see this in this lesson. It could have been done prior to the unit or at the beginning of the unit. It really didn't happen. And so while we've been working hard on language scaffolding, I think that what we need to go back and work more on is certainly that culturally sustaining practices aspect. Okay, so I'm going to put this on, and again, take out a piece of paper. You're going to be looking specifically at the P, so pre-teaching critical vocabulary knowledge and background knowledge and language use and modeling. So here we go. And it's about a 5-minute video. I might cut it short. We'll see how this goes. And I am not able to see the chats. If hopefully you'll be able to hear it. So here are the look-fors.
Visible and invisible.
Julie,
Yeah.
it looks like you may have to reshare your screen with the video because we can't see the video, but the sound was working.
Okay, great. I'm going to stop that.
Tell me you have it taped.
Perfect.
Thank you.
What sheet, ready? I believe the word discouraged. Repeat.
I believe the word discouraged.
Fits best with because go.
Fits best with because
Nicely done. You are going to put your discouraged in visible or invisible. Remember, visible means you can see it. Can you see discouraged? Invisible means you cannot see it. Discouraged. Feel helpless. Put it thumbs up. More pack shows me you have it in the spot. If you need help spelling discouraged, it's on the board. All right, you're telling yourself in pepper partner salt, you're gonna start. I believe the word discouraged. Take back the because ready, set, go.
I believe discouraged fits best in the I believe discouraged fits best in the I believe the word discouraged fits best in visible side because
Pack telling me salt and pepper have said their sentence.
I believe discouraged fits best in the invisible side because if someone is like feeling like happy, you can like help them.
Can you see it on your face sometimes?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
So is it visible?
Oh.
All right, here we go. We're gonna push in our chairs. We're gonna stand up. We're gonna move. Here we go. Walk, walk, walk until you hear the sound. Now remember, we can agree and disagree with our partners. If you also put it invisible, agree or disagree. Back to your seats. Let's do it in 4. Chop, chop. Chop, chop. This sentence. I believe this courage. If I have the first story on the board, you have it. Starting at that pink line. I believe the word discouraged. You are writing the sentence we just said. Reread your sentence. Make sure you have every single word that needs to be there. Capital and a period. Thumbs up and taps together shows me you are done. All right. So writing, can you share your sentence with me? Are inside that, and we don't always show it. I love it. Agree or disagree, Mr. What's the word? You got it. What would be the visible thing? Okay, what's invisible? That you. Amazing. All right, nicely done. Respectfully disagree. All right, our next one is one of our favorites this week. It's stubborn. What's the word?
Stubborn.
Talk about ready, go.
Stubborn.
Right. If you're stubborn, it means that you are not going to change your mind, right? You're not going to change your mind. You're very determined. Remember, we worked on being stubborn yesterday. You're going to use your text tool. You're going to write the word stubborn. You are going to decide, is it something invisible, you can see it, or is it invisible? Clever partner, I believe stubborn. Ready, set, let's have Pepper start. Ready, set, go. One more word, but we're going to go to our inside, outside, inside, outside. And we are doing the word permission. What's the word?
Permission.
It's, come out. There you go. Permission. I want to really do my work right now. So I want you to get that study. If you have permission for something, you have access to it. Yes, if you have permission, right, you have access to something, someone has allowed you to do it. Inside, outside. You are writing with your text tool, just like last time. Permission. Type it. Does it go in the inside? You get permission this time, or does it go outside? You get permission outside. Right, with your salt and pepper, salt are going first. I believe the word permission fits best with inside or outside. Salt, ready, go. You are writing this final sentence. This should be your best sentence yet. I believe everything is spelled right. Every sentence starts with a capital and with a period.
Okay, so.
Get MailChimp's advanced yet easy-to-use tools and start leading more customers down the path to purchase. You are more than a small business. And
Okay. I'm still working on this technology piece. Okay, we're back. So what I want you to do now is just put in the chat, what were the strategies that you saw being used? Now, I did notice in the chat that somebody was mentioning the speed, of instruction in gen ed classrooms. Yes, they are quite fast paced, but I also want you to think about, did she scaffold language? Was this comprehensible to students? Did everybody have a part? And to also know that it's an inclusive classroom. There were students in there who were English learners and have IEPs, and they were able to successfully follow the lesson. So I'll be looking at the chat. What did you see? I'm trying to find the chat. Here we go. Clapped in syllables, yes, at the bottom of the reading rope, you'll repeating the words out loud. What else? What other effective practices did you see for language practice, vocabulary practice, choral response? Great. Sentence frames, yes. And I'll also point out that for particularly one student who is an English learner or EB and has an IEP, the teacher checked in with her quite a bit. Yes, I think this may be from Anita Archer's protocol. Yes, great. And then it culminated in her writing. Great. So was this effective practice? Okay, sounded like singing. So there was lots of active engagements happening. Students had sentence frames on the iPad. They were also up on the board. And so that is an example of how these explicit vocabulary and language opportunities can be used along with, within core instruction and along with kind of core material, mandatory material. Okay, so the other components of our model then is strategically using pictures, graphic organizers, gestures realia, and other visual prompts to make critical language concepts become comprehensible. We have a research sample or a sample of the research for every component we have. And there are some examples here, illustrated word walls, and on that I'm sure you are all familiar with many of strategies here. Here's one example of a sequence for growing tomatoes that was used, and it also was teaching the past tense, which I know we have a lot of students that have difficulty with that past tense, and language frames for that. So that's an example of one graphic organizer. And then now we're going to move to systematic and explicit instruction, which again is the heart of the intervention programs. It is the way in which intervention programs are delivered, but it may not be the way that instruction is often delivered in a general ed classroom, but it can be done that way. And you saw the teacher in this gen ed video doing that kind of very direct instruction. There are times when that is absolutely needed. And that's not to say we're not going to provide students with multicultural and appropriate literature and good literature to work with. But there are times when students really need to learn the skills. And we know from research that our students, again, we know what data looks like in achievement, that we need to make sure that we're teaching those skills. So that's what the systematic and explicit instruction is on the skills. And strategic use of native language and teaching for transfer. As has been mentioned in previous presentations, students may come to us with a lot of knowledge in their native language, and we want to scaffold that. As a matter of fact, I had one of my students call me 2 days ago. She was in her practicum placement, and she mentioned that it was an English-only school with a lot of EB students there, and that the teacher had posed a question to the class. One of our EB students answered in Spanish, and the teacher says, no, that's wrong. It is butterfly or whatever. And my student teacher said, but I speak Spanish, and I knew that he had said the right answer, and I didn't really know what to do. So it's important that perhaps that teacher could have stopped and looked up his answer to see if it was correct, or asked her because she spoke Spanish. And sometimes there's other personnel that speak the children's native language that we can ask. My point is we really can't shut down students in their knowledge. So we want to have them be able to bring their assets and show what they know. And that strategic use of native language. Sometimes we can do a quick definition, and then right away that the student knows the concept. And so it's a quick bridge. So here's an example that can look like dual language glossaries that you purchase, or ones that students make on their own. Now I'm looking at our time, and we won't have time to watch the second video. You can do that on your own because they're all posted on the Project Lay website for you to watch. And this video, which is called a comprehension video, it's the same teacher. I was going to ask you to look at the amount of times that the students responded and whether they were individual responses, partner responses, or large group responses. And I'll just tell you that, she did a great example of all of those, and how many opportunities the students had to respond. So it's not a quiet classroom, and there was lots of language use going on. So with that, for our students to succeed, every school needs a robust system that provides culturally and linguistically responsive instruction, interventions, and assessment. Every teacher needs to understand the impact of second language acquisition on learning new concepts. And it is with this grounding that fair and equitable decisions can be made about our students. So until, sorry, my timer, until we can say unequivocally that Tier 1 instruction is meeting the needs of all students, and it's really hard to make those decisions about difference in disability. Okay, so here are more of the resources that can be found on our website. There is a free downloadable booklet in English and Spanish about the PLUS model. So feel free to look at that and download it. There's also, under the resource tabs, if they're in English, I'm sorry, English only, but 5 briefs on multicultural, linguistically and culturally responsive MTSS systems, special education and EBs, working with families and working with leadership. These are really great kind of short briefs that can be shared across your teams. And I know that right now, at least 2 states that I know of are using these statewide, Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. So they're great resources. Again, they're free. And last but not least, here is a collaborative website of our model demonstration projects that might have some more resources to look at. And my recently published book, it's a couple of years old, it really is talking about difference in disability. So take a look at that. It's easily available on Amazon, maybe not our favorite place, but it comes quickly. And with that, I am going to stop so that our next speaker has her full time. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I myself am also totally enjoying this conference. So thank you. Gracias.